I placed the folder on the kitchen table without saying a word. 43 pages, printed double-sided, held together with a single binder clip. My solicitor had helped me organize them the week before. Every transfer, every withdrawal, every receipt. I didn't push it toward her. I just let it sit there, the way you let a cold wind speak for itself. She looked at it. Then she looked at me. Then she looked away. That was the moment I knew everything I needed to know. My name is Graham Whitfield. I'm 63 years old. I worked for 31 years as a maintenance supervisor at a paper mill outside Masterton, in the Wairarapa. It's not glamorous work. It never was. But I was good at it. And it paid steadily. And I built a life on that steadiness, the way you build a fence post by post, wire by wire, no shortcuts. I bought my house in 1991. 3 bedrooms, a decent section. A vegetable garden out back that my first wife, Carol, planted the year we moved in. Carol passed away in 2009 from a cancer that moved faster than any of us were ready for. She was 51. We had 22 years together. And I won't pretend those weren't the best years of my life, because they were. After she went, I rattled around that house for 4 years on my own, keeping the garden going because it felt like the only conversation I had left with her. I met Diane in 2013 at a community fundraiser in town. She was warm and quick to laugh, and she seemed to understand what it meant to have lost someone. Her own husband had died several years earlier, she told me, leaving her to raise her daughter, Kylie, mostly on her own. Kylie was 24 at the time. She had a partner and a flat in Lower Hutt. And she seemed settled enough that I didn't think much about it. Diane and I married in 2015. I was 54. She was 50. I won't say I rushed it, but I will say I was lonelier than I admitted to myself, and loneliness has a way of making warm seem like enough. For the first 2 years, things were fine. Diane worked part-time at a medical center in town doing reception. Kylie visited occasionally Christmas, the odd long weekend. We got along reasonably well. I helped Kylie and her partner, Brendan, with a car repair once, and I lent them money for a bond when they moved flats, which they paid back in dribs and drabs over about 18 months. I didn't mind that. I'm not someone who keeps score over small things. The problems started in late 2021, about 6 years into the marriage. I noticed them the way you notice a slow leak. Not all at once, but in the accumulation of small things that don't quite add up. Diane stopped working. She'd been reducing her hours at the medical center for most of that year, and by October she'd finished up entirely. She told me her back was causing her trouble and that she needed a rest. I said nothing. She was 56. I figured she'd earned a break. Then Kylie and Brendan split up. He moved out of their flat, and Kylie, without much discussion, moved back to Diane's. To our house, that is. She arrived with 2 carloads of belongings, one Thursday afternoon while I was still at work. By the time I got home, her things were stacked in the spare room, and Diane was making dinner as though nothing unusual had happened. I asked how long Kylie was planning to stay. Diane said, "Just until she finds her feet." I thought that meant a few weeks, maybe a month or 2. That was November 2021. Kylie was still there in March 2024. In those 2.5 years, she worked occasionally a few months at a cafe, a short stint at a warehouse, but nothing that stuck. Most of the time, she was home. She had friends who came and went. A new partner named Lachlan, who seemed to be at our house 4 or 5 nights a week without ever appearing to contribute anything, and a habit of leaving the kitchen in a state that I started to associate with a kind of deliberate disregard. I don't want to make this about petty grievances. The kitchen isn't the point. The point is what I didn't know was happening financially while I was focused on the kitchen. I am not a complicated man with money. I have one salary, deposited fortnightly. I have a mortgage that I've been paying since 1991, and that was nearly settled. I have a joint account with Diane for household expenses, which I top up from my personal account each month. And I have a small term deposit that I started in 2018, and add to when I can money I'd intended to use in retirement, which was not far off. In early 2023, I started noticing that the joint account was running lower than it should have been. Not dramatically low, nothing that alarmed me immediately, but lower. Grocery bills seemed higher. I'd check the balance and find we were further into the buffer than I expected. I mentioned it to Diane twice. She said prices were up everywhere. She wasn't wrong about that. I let it go. Then in August 2023, my credit card was declined at Mitre 10. I was buying a bag of fertilizer and some wire mesh for the garden. $62. The card went through on a second attempt, but it bothered me. I knew what my balance was. I checked it online that evening and found that the credit limit had been raised. I hadn't done that, and that there were several purchases I didn't recognize. A clothing order, 2 spa treatments, a grocery delivery to an address that wasn't mine. I sat with that for a long time before I said anything. I'm not someone who moves quickly when I'm unsettled. I prefer to understand what I'm looking at before I speak. So I spent a week going through statements, bank statements, credit card statements, the joint account history, going back to January 2022. What I found took my breath away, and not in a good way. Over 22 months, there had been a pattern of transfers from the joint account to a separate account I didn't recognize. They were regular, not always the same amount, not always on the same day, but consistent. Sometimes $400, sometimes $650. Once, in March 2023, $1,200 in a single transfer. Across the full period, the total came to just over $19,000. The credit card showed $7,300 in purchases I couldn't account for. Some were clearly Diane's beauty appointments, clothing, a weekend in Wellington I knew nothing about. Some appeared to be Kylie's. Her previous address in Lower Hutt appeared on several delivery receipts I managed to trace back through the account notes. And the term deposit. I hadn't checked the term deposit since I'd rolled it over in June 2022. When I logged in, I found a partial withdrawal I had no memory of authorizing. $8,5 taken out in September 2022. The bank had a record of a phone call. A woman's voice, confirming details I had apparently provided. I had not made that call. I Monday. The total, when I added it all up carefully and checked it twice, was somewhere between $34,000 and $37,000. Over 22 months, while I drove to work each morning, while I fixed the fence posts, while I kept the garden going, because it was the last conversation I had with Carol. I want to be honest about how I felt in that moment. Because I think it matters. I wasn't just angry. Anger would have been simpler. What I felt was something older and heavier than anger, a kind of grief, almost, for the version of my life I had believed I was living. I had thought I was a man building something, slowly, quietly, in the way people of my generation were taught to build, through work, through consistency, through showing up. And what the statements told me was that while I was building, someone was taking the bricks. I did not confront Diane immediately. I know that might seem strange, but I am 63 years old and I have learned through Carol's illness, through the years alone, through 31 years of managing equipment that would kill you if you approached it without respect, that how you respond to a crisis matters as much as the fact of the crisis itself. I needed to be prepared. I needed to be certain. And I needed help. I rang a solicitor in Masterton that I'd used once before for a property matter. I explained the situation calmly, which took some effort. She listened without interrupting. And then she told me what I needed to do and in what order. The first step was documentation. The second was protecting what remained. The third, when I was ready, was a conversation. Over the next 3 weeks, I printed everything. I opened a new personal account at a different bank. I redirected my salary there quietly, on a Tuesday morning before work. I spoke to the term deposit provider and added a dual authorization requirement for any future withdrawals. I changed the passwords on every account I held. I said nothing at home. The Friday after my salary was redirected, I came home from work at my usual time. Diane was in the lounge. Kylie was in the kitchen. Everything looked normal. I made a cup of tea and sat down. Diane's phone rang about 40 minutes later. She looked at the screen and left the room. I heard her voice from the hallway, low and tight, in a way I recognized as controlled alarm. She came back in and stood in the doorway. "The account," she said. "There's nothing in it," I said. "Which account?" She said. "The joint account. My card was declined at the New World," I said. "I moved my salary." She stared at me. "What do you mean?" "Moved it? I mean I opened a new account and directed my pay there. The joint account will only have what I choose to put in it from now on." There was a silence that I imagine lasted about 15 seconds but felt considerably longer. Then, Kylie came in from the kitchen. Apparently, she'd been listening from the hallway. Her face was doing something complicated, somewhere between outraged and frightened, and she said, "What's going on?" Diane said, "He's moved his money." Kylie looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen from her before. She said, "You can't just do that." I said, "I just did." Then Diane said something I have thought about many times since. She said, "You've got no right to cut us off without any warning. That's not how a marriage works." I let that sit for a moment. Then I put down my cup of tea, went to the kitchen table, and placed the folder down. 43 pages. I said, "Before we talk about how a marriage works, I'd like to talk about this." Diane came to the table. She opened the folder. She looked at the first page, a summary sheet my solicitor had helped me prepare, with dates, amounts, and account numbers. Her face went very still. Kylie said, "What is that?" I said, "It's 22 months of financial records. Would you like me to walk you through them, or would you prefer to read them yourself?" Nobody answered. I walked them through the first section anyway, the joint account transfers. I read the dates and the amounts aloud, slowly. The way I used to read equipment inspection reports at work. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't use adjectives. I just read the numbers. When I got to the $1,200 transfer in March 2023, Diane sat down. I kept going. When I got to the credit card section, I watched Kylie's expression change. She crossed her arms. She looked at the floor. I pointed out the delivery address, her former address in Lower Hutt, on 3 of the purchases. She said nothing. When I got to the term deposit, Diane put her hands over her face. I closed the folder. I said, "I've spoken to a solicitor. I've also spoken to my bank, who have a record of the phone call in September 2022. I want you to understand that I have taken legal advice and that I know what my options are. I am not asking for an explanation tonight. I am telling you what I know, and I am telling you that things are going to change." Diane took her hands from her face. Her eyes were wet, but her voice, when she found it, was harder than I expected. She said, "You've been going behind my back." I said, "I protected what was mine." She said, "We're married. What's yours is mine." I said, "A marriage is not a license to take. What you've done isn't partnership, it's theft. And I think part of you has always known that." Kylie said, "Mum didn't," and then stopped. I looked at her. I said, "I'm not going to have this conversation with you tonight, Kylie. This is between me and your mother." but I want you to know that I am aware of your involvement, and that will also be addressed." There was another long silence. Then Diane said, quietly, almost to herself, "I didn't think you'd notice." I've replayed that sentence many times. I didn't think you'd notice. Not "I'm sorry." Not "I can explain." Just, "I didn't think you'd notice." I've come to believe it was the most honest thing she said to me in a long time. I told Diane that I wanted her to contact a solicitor of her own the following week. I told her that I had already begun the process of understanding what a separation would look like, and that I intended to approach it fairly, but that I would not be returning to the financial arrangement we'd had. I told her that Kylie would need to make plans to move out within 30 days. Diane didn't fight me on any of it that night. I think the folder had taken the fight out of her. Kylie left the room without speaking. I heard her upstairs, on the phone, not long after. I slept in the spare room, her old room, which still had some of her boxes stacked in the corner, and I lay awake for a while looking at the ceiling. I didn't feel triumphant. I want to be clear about that. There was no satisfaction in it. What I felt was something closer to tired and clear at the same time, the kind of clarity you get when you've been carrying something heavy for months and you finally put it down. Over the weeks that followed, the situation moved the way these things do slowly. Then, all at once, Diane retained a solicitor. We communicated mostly through them after the first week, which suited me fine. She contested some of the financial claims initially. Her solicitor wrote a letter suggesting that household expenses had risen legitimately and that some of the withdrawals represented Diane's contribution to the joint running of the home. My solicitor replied with the delivery addresses and the spa receipts and the Wellington hotel booking, and the contestation went quiet after that. Kylie moved out in 3 weeks, not 4. She went to stay with a friend in Palmerston North. Lachlan, to no one's great surprise, did not go with her. I changed the locks the day she left. My solicitor had advised me to document the condition of the spare room before and after, which I did. The term deposit matter became a separate issue. The bank investigated the September 2022 call. They could not conclusively prove who had made it, but they acknowledged that their verification process had been insufficient and reached a partial settlement with me that recovered a portion of the $8,500. My solicitor said it was better than she'd expected. The separation itself took about 7 months to finalize. The house was the central issue. It had been mine before the marriage, and under New Zealand law, relationship property rules applied after 3 years of living together. We were well past that. But because the financial misconduct was documentable and because my solicitor presented the case clearly, the final settlement was structured in a way that I felt was just, though I won't claim it was painless. In the end, Diane moved to a rental in Carterton. I kept the house. I kept the garden. It has been just over a year now since the folder went down on the table. I'm still at the paper mill, though I'm planning to retire next year. The mortgage is settled. The term deposit has been rebuilt. Slowly. The vegetable garden came back strong this spring, the silver beet especially, which Carol always said was impossible to kill if you treated it reasonably. I think about what I would tell someone in the situation I was in before I printed those 43 pages. When I still half knew something was wrong, but hadn't yet looked directly at it, I would say, look directly at it. The thing you half know is almost always the thing you most need to know. I would say, before you say a word to anyone in that house, speak to a solicitor, not because you're planning to be adversarial, but because understanding your position clearly is the kindest thing you can do for yourself and, in a strange way, for everyone else involved. Decisions made from ignorance are almost always worse than decisions made from information. I would say, keep records. Not out of suspicion, not out of some cold transactional approach to marriage, but because memory is fallible and documents are not. If something has been done with your money that shouldn't have been, The record is what gives you standing. I would say quiet action is not the same as weakness. Moving my salary was not dramatic. It was not a confrontation. It was a decision I made alone in the morning on a computer. But it changed everything because it changed who held the information in that house. And information, I've learned, is what power is actually made of. I would say, your financial independence is not selfishness. This was the thing Diane returned to most, the idea that protecting my own account was a betrayal of the marriage. But a marriage is not a merger with no individual parts. You are allowed to have something that is yours. You are allowed to say, this is what I earned, and I will decide how it is used. I would say, the anger you feel when someone crosses that boundary is not something to suppress or feel ashamed of. It is information. It is your own quiet self telling you that something matters, that you matter, that the fence you've built post by post deserves to stand. I would say, if you are a man of my generation, you may have been raised to handle things quietly, to not make a fuss, to absorb difficulty without complaint. That quietness is not always a virtue. Sometimes it becomes the thing that allows other people to keep taking. And I would say this, finally, as plainly as I can, the people who become furious when you protect what is yours, who show up or call or come into the room with outrage because you have redirected your own money, are usually not angry because you've done something wrong. They are angry because you've done something right. And that anger, that indignation, is the clearest possible sign that you have made exactly the correct decision. The folder is still in my filing cabinet. I kept it because my solicitor told me to. But sometimes, I think I kept it for another reason too, to remind myself that I looked. That when the thing I half knew became something I fully knew, I didn't look away from it. That, in the end, is the only thing I'm proud of in this whole business. Not the outcome, not the settlement, not the fact that I was right, just that I looked. Before we go, I'd love to know how you found Hollow Tales. Did YouTube suggest this to you? Did a friend share it? Or have you been following along for a while? Let me know in the comments. It means more than you'd think to know where you're listening from.